Hi everyone, and welcome so much to this Joseph Rowntree Foundation report on Time for Action with Care. I'm Sophie McBain, I'm an Associate Editor at New Statesman, and I'm here with Carolina Gerlich. She is the CEO of the Care Workers Charity, which has to date supported over 9,000 care workers with £5 million in grants. And Veronica Deutsch, she is a researcher and community organiser who co-founded the Nanny Solidarity Network. And also helped found the first union branch for nannies and au pairs. With Trudy Bell, she's the CEO of Bellevue, and which is taking a novel approach to delivering high quality home care for adults. And also Amy Peterton over there, who is a lecturer in economic geography at UCL, and she studies how different ownership models shape adult residential care homes. And for years, the multiple overlapping crises in the care sector have been intensified. Care has been hard to find and unaffordable. Become hard to find out unfortunately, while care workers are among the lowest paid workers in the country. As the population ages, more people need care, but many in the workforce are burnt out and are leaving in large numbers. 4 in 10 delays in discharge from hospital are due to patients waiting for adult social care. And Age UK estimates that 2.5 million people in England aged over 50 need some kind of help but are unable to get it. The government has delayed plans to cap costs, which for 1 in 7 adults will be over £100,000. In terms of childcare, 1 in 4 mothers say that costs are so expensive that work no longer makes financial sense. And a recent survey found that government underfunding means a third of childcare providers are at risk of going out of business this year alone. The government has pledged to expand childcare subsidies, and as the population ages, social care is likely to become an ever greater part of the welfare state. So the questions we're going to be thinking about today is how can we make care in this country both better and fairer, affordable to those who need it, and yet rewarding fairly paid work for those who provide it. When we all as individuals understand how important care is, how do we as a society why do we struggle to properly recognise and value care work? How do we reshape our views of caring and those who provide it? So often the public conversation around care work excludes or sidelines the voices of those who work in the sector, who understand the problems intimately and from a complete front line and from all sides. So I'm really, really delighted to be having this conversation with 4 women who have a first-hand, really deep understanding of care work. They're going to introduce themselves to you first and some of the work that they do and their views. And then at the end of the discussion, there'll be a chance for anyone in the audience to ask questions as well. So over to you, Carolina.
Thank you all for attending this afternoon. So first of all, I was a care worker for many years, mainly working in home care and as a live-in care worker. And since 2020, I've been a CEO for the Care Workers Charity. And we are a benevolent fund. We support care workers financially with grants that are on average £500, and we support care workers in the hour of need. That's either around, at the moment, mainly around the cost of living crisis, so with food and bills, making sure that care workers themselves can make sure that they can eat and their children are fed, that they can pay their bills, they can replace a broken washing machine or a broken oven. They can pay for car repairs and fuel and get to work. They can pay for bills when they're off work sick, because many care workers don't get full sick pay, they're only on statutory sick pay. We also support them with mental health support, which is free therapy, and we also train mental health first aiders. We do a lot of campaigning around care workers as skilled workers that should have respect and recognition for the important work that they do. Because really we can't imagine more important work than supporting lives of other people. As it's been mentioned, since 2020, we have supported over 9,000 care workers with £5 million.
Can I just suggest you use the microphone? Have you got a microphone?
If they're cutting out, I think that's it.
Should we try to fix it instead of the
Thank you. Let's see if it works better. I think in the previous session it's been really cutting out.
Cutting out all the time.
Is this working?
I'll go get someone from IT.
Let's try. Right.
Just a handover is the key.
Is it right?
That you need to just wiggle around a bit. Wiggle around.
Hello? Oh, okay. I've been told my voice doesn't carry either, so we'll see if this keeps working. Hi, I'm Veronica. I am a researcher and community organiser. I was a nanny, a childcare worker for 9 years before I had my first son, and as part of that, in the first lockdown, I helped to co-found the Nanny Solidarity Network, which is a grassroots mutual aid organisation that supports primarily migrant nannies and au pairs in the UK. And so what the network does is offer space for collective action, community events, emergency aid through our hardship fund and housing programmes, and we can also connect nannies and au pairs with legal advice. As part of that, I also helped to establish the first trade union branch specifically for nannies and au pairs in the UK with independent workers of Great Britain. So that's the nannies and au pairs branch that started in 2021. And now I freelance across the academic, non-profit and grassroots spaces to sort of think through answers to the childcare crisis and build solutions. So part of that work at the moment is I am a coordinator on an activist oral history project, which is looking at the history of childcare organising in East London and bringing the stories of past childcare campaigners to present campaigners to sort of see if looking at past solutions can be can support and provide framework to people organising today. So yeah, that's a bit about what I've been doing.
Thank you. Can we get this to work? It's all about wiggling the cable, is it? Rightio. Oh, that sounds better. Lovely to meet you all. So I'm Trudy, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Belvie. Years ago, when I was a student and needed a part-time job, I worked as a care worker, and I loved it. I felt like I was doing a job that really mattered. It gave me a sense of purpose, as opposed to the bar work, waitressing alternatives I could have done. But I also was really shocked to discover how poorly valued care work was, just when I told people what I was doing. Those two things stayed with me. I ended up, my studies took me into software development. I spent most of my career working in IT, but then got to a point where I wanted to combine my business and tech skills and do something that had more purpose and meaning. And I came back to care work. One of the things I'm most proud of in my IT career is transforming big groups of people, hundreds of people, from a very hierarchical command and control structure to small self-managing teams. Or agile software development, as many people will know, is now a default in IT. So the light bulb moment for us when we founded our company was when we stumbled across a model which has revolutionised nursing in the Netherlands called Buurtzorg. Because Buurtzorg is all about small self-managing teams that empowers their nurses to make the day-to-day decisions. And you know what? It works. They now deliver 60% of the equivalent of district nursing over in the Netherlands. They have really high employee engagement, low employee turnover, great patient satisfaction, and it works financially too. I don't think I'd have made the leap from IT to care if we hadn't seen it working successfully in nursing in another country. But when we saw that, I thought, yes, this is it. So Belvie was born to bring a Buurtzorg-inspired model to care work in this country and to do that at scale. We're 4 years old and it's working, which is great. We've still got a long way to go. But yeah, that's my background and looking forward to sharing more with you.
All right. Hopefully I'm not going to sort of lasso the whole panel and tip you over. Hi everybody, my name is Amy Horton. As Sophie said, I work at University College London, and I've been researching social care, mostly care homes for older people in the UK for the better part of a decade now. And I got interested in social care as a sector where, there's tons of jobs, mostly done by women, disproportionately done by migrant workers. And it's a sector that, as you'll know, is largely characterised by low pay. But alongside that, it's also been an area of interest for high finance. And so my work has been looking at what proportion of care homes are owned by investment funds, such as private equity and so on, which, some people might not expect to find in a sector like care. So I've looked at some of the corporate accounts and business models and so on, and also done interviews with both people working in finance, some of whom have been helpfully indiscreet about what they are up to and what they think about the sector, and with care staff and managers themselves. So yeah, I've been investigating questions like what happens when an investment fund buys a care company. What kind of care homes do they want to build and where? And how is this experience from a staff perspective? And recently, with colleagues from a think tank and some other academics, I did a project trying to see how much extra funding care homes got during the pandemic in the UK, which was surprisingly difficult to get the amount from government, but we came up with a figure of about £2.1 billion of extra support in the first year of the pandemic. And we looked at where that money went depending on the different business models. So I'll stop there for now, but happy to say a bit more about the findings.
So okay, great. You can actually hear me now. So to start, I mean, I wondered, Carolina, if you could explain a little bit about how we got to this situation. Like, why has care work been so traditionally undervalued and underpaid? Is it because it's something that women historically did for free? Are there other things that have been contributing to get us to here?
I think there are many different reasons where we are. One of them is that the lives of people. Okay, wrong situation. One of the main reasons is that the lives that care workers support are not valued by the society. So we're talking about lives of older people, lives of disabled people, generally the lives of people who draw on social care. That's one of the biggest problems that we have. Therefore, the lives of care workers who support those lives and the work that they do, that's not well paid, that's not acknowledged and respected in the society. So the ableist attitudes that we have in the society really need to change for the work of care workers to be better paid and more respected. Secondly, what you've already mentioned, women's work that for decades, for centuries, for millennia has been done behind closed doors, has been done for free, has been done at the times in the past where women weren't going to work necessarily, so they were expected to just do it for free. And still expected to do for free after work, in between all the other duties. So that's the contributing factor. Then we add to it quite a high proportion of migrant workers that work in social care. So again, a workforce that doesn't really have a strong voice, people who are scared to speak up. Then we have an issue of quite low unionization of the workforce in social care. So people who are not really easily able and to come together, to have a strong voice in the sector and to make demands. And then you have the nature of people who work in care, people who are very giving, so therefore people who are very easy to take advantage of. And I think that's in a way the biggest problem. I think the government, talking about the national government, knows very well that care workers, even if they could, as a large group, wouldn't go and strike, because care worker wouldn't want to put lives of people they support at risk. It would be very, very hard. And I'm not saying that doctors or nurses or anybody else who goes on strike do it lightheartedly. They really, really don't. But I think care workers would potentially find it even harder. And that really is a very big problem. That giving, caring nature of love, of self-sacrifice, that's what puts care workers at risk of being taken advantage of day after day after day. And there was a time during COVID, I think in 2020, around June, July, when we're all clapping for doctors and nurses and carers at some point, where I thought, oh, maybe there is hope. maybe the tide can turn and we can all start recognizing social care and care workers, and then it all went away because the blame game started, and it was all the fault of social care because people were dying. It wasn't the fault of poor policy because we forgot to actually put support for especially care homes, or even forgot, well, I say we, the government, that home care existed, or personal assistant existed, and there was no PPE for them, or any other support, and social care was left to deal with it all by itself. But yes, there's an intersection of so many different issues and factors that is very difficult to deal with it. But I promised I'm not going to be too negative today. So we know there are many issues, but what we need to try is to think about solutions. And I think there are many things to think about that we can try to address, to solve. And for me, as somebody who has been a care worker and who works with the workforce and wants to support for care workers, is to remember that we are talking about people who are incredibly skilled, who are incredibly giving, and that we need to start treating with respect and recognition that they deserve, that need to be paid for the work that they do, and that as a society we just really need to start looking up to them and stop looking down upon them and just saying you're just a carer.
I think it was really interesting what you mentioned about the sort of overcoming that, how easy it's been to exploit care workers, because I know, Veronica, you've been doing lots of work on unionisation and collective action, and I wondered if you could, I mean, perhaps inject a little bit of hope into this. Like, what can you achieve through collective action? What are you hoping might change through the work that you're doing?
I don't know. I feel like I might not be very hopeful. I don't know. I think that collective action is an incredible tool to improve pay and conditions for any workforce, because that's its function. And we've seen huge rise in strike action, industrial action across sectors in the past year, with doctors, nurses, teachers. I think for me, the question is less, whether collective action can be useful, and more, why isn't it happening? And I think that you really touched, Caroline, on why there isn't a lot of collective action in the sector. It's a hard sector to organise, and I think that it comes down to. I might have to go. If I go without the microphone, is that going to be a problem? Okay, yeah. Sorry, where was I?
Why is it? Why are the collective action happening?
Collective action isn't happening because, for two reasons. Care workers work in domestic settings and are disparate. So that kind of water cooler discussion that can help facilitate the local action that then builds grassroots movements is a lot harder to achieve than it is in traditional sectors. And additionally, I think what Carolina touched on was this idea that we can't strike, and it reminds me of conversations that I had during my time at IWGB with the foster care workers branch, saying that, we really want to take action, we want to improve our conditions, but we can't strike because we can't do that to the children in our care. And I think when you're immediately having to rule out ways of taking action, you are starting on the back foot. And so, in my experience of organising nannies and au pairs, striking isn't an option because we don't have a collective employer or a collective workplace. Strategic litigation is ruled out because a lot of our workers are working in the informal economy. So it means that our means of collective bargaining are limited. And so for me, I think the solution is to build local conversations and to support workers to conceptualise their economic value. And I think that's something that care workers really struggle with. Care workers really struggle to think of themselves in terms of being workers because, as Caroline said, a lot of people who get into the care sector are doing it because they are giving and they want to make a difference. Oh, thank you. Hello? Okay. Care workers are coming to the sector because they're altruistic, because they're giving, because they want to make a difference, and often because they really love their work. And I think that's why the retention crisis has been such a shame, because there are people who are skilled, who love their job, who for them it just isn't tenable, it isn't financially viable for them to keep going. And so I think that a lot of the workforce are really uncomfortable about talking about their work in terms of the money, because they say, oh, we don't do it for the money. And those are the conversations that need to happen in order for us to be able to start talking about collective bargaining. So I think where we need to start is by allowing for workers to come together and start thinking through their economic value, and start having those conversations, and start letting it be okay for care workers to not just be this kind of clap for carers, altruistic saviours, but also these workers who deserve proper pay and conditions.
And Trudy, I know that that's something that's been sort of very central to your model, has been making sure that you're finding great people and rewarding them for the valuable work they do. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about how you're managing that, and also how, I suppose, private enterprise like you can play a role more widely, how you can replicate the model more widely across the UK.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so I do have hope for the future. And Colleen did a great job of explaining why we are where we are. But isn't it time to look forward? Because actually, I really believe it is absolutely now that is the time for change. So you look at the bigger picture. We have a whole load of sectors which are being automated, and I come from a technology background. Actually, I love technology, but done in the right way. Not putting the power just in the people who own the business and technology. But there's a consequence to all this. We also have the care sector in desperate need of more care work. So we've got over 160,000 vacancies in care today, right now. 110,000 people leave their care jobs every day. Why are they doing that? We need to change it. And yet while other jobs are being automated, care work never will. Let's attract people. Let's change the narrative around care work and attract people to what can be, and I've experienced and others have experienced, is an incredibly fulfilling job, a fulfilling career, profession. And when they're in, let's retain them. So for me, that means a different way of working, a way of working that really values care workers. And if we focus on the care workers, then, well, surely isn't that the only way to deliver great care? Because only if I feel valued and I'm thriving at work, could I possibly support somebody else to feel valued and to thrive in their life? So ultimately, that's the vision that we're after. That's where we're going, and I think private enterprise can play a really good role in this, and taking it forward. Because we talked a bit about kind of, well, we need change and we need innovation. So where's innovation going to come from? Local authorities are the biggest payer, the biggest spender on, the biggest customer for social care. That's not the place that's really going to innovate. They have such a tough job. I feel for commissioners. They've got limited money and a lot of calls on that cash. So the innovation has to come from somewhere else, and that's where we come in. Because there are local authorities, bring that bit of hope. There are local authorities who will think differently. Not all of them, we need more, so we need a bit more campaigning as well. But when they are willing to think differently and say, okay, we'll commission a bit differently. What's the problem you have? We're seeing that providers can't recruit and retain. Oh, you've got a different operating model that can recruit and retain? Let's talk about how we fund that. And we have had success in that. One of the areas we work in is Northumberland. I have to speak even louder now. In Northumberland, and the majority of our revenue comes from the local council up there, and they pay us differently. They pay for a whole team of care workers, so that we can share with them and say, well, we pay fairly, so we pay for the whole shift. Lots of care companies will only pay for the time that you're actually with somebody who supports, known as contact time. So that means that a care worker could be out for, say 6 hours, but only be paid for 4 hours out of that 6. Now, that's why people leave and go and work in a supermarket or an Amazon warehouse instead. Not because they don't enjoy the job. They like the work, it's the things around it they don't like. So we need to change that. So we pay the real living wage and we pay for whole shifts. That's the big difference. So we speak to the councils and say, well, this is our setup. We'll be really transparent. But what they have is they have large numbers of people that need support, which is very different from if we're selling B2C one at a time to people who fund their own care. So I said, well, you can help us fill the gaps in the rota to make it more cost effective for us. Here are our unit economics. Help us with this and we can give you a lower price, that one that's going to work in your budgets. And when we have those conversations, when we work together, and I love the overall feeling from this event because it's about collaboration and working together to fix real problems. When that happens, we can support people and provide amazing quality care because we've created really great jobs. And that, at a very simple level, is what we're about. So I'm optimistic because we're getting this working with one council. We also need to recognise that around 30% of care is funded by people themselves or their families. And that actually keeps us honest because they will argue for quality care, not just cost. So we very proudly will deliver the same quality of care to everybody, irrespective of who pays them. And increasingly, about 10%ish, but the number's going up, of care is funded by the NHS. And actually, the NHS might complain about not having much money compared to social care. They have a huge amount of money. We do a small amount of work with the NHS as well. And by spreading our work across those three payers, but providing the same quality of support, we're starting to see change. What I'd really like is to drive that systemic change. Let's stop this being about just small bits of good work happening in different places, but let's really drive that innovation. So change the narrative around care work, and at the same time we're changing the narrative around ageing.
Just wanted to jump briefly on because I think you said something at the beginning that for me just got to the crux of the issue, and I think it was so important, is that care can't be sped up and care can't be automated. And I think that that's something so key to acknowledge, in that societally we are hardwired to think of work in terms of productivity. So it's about output, it's about profit, it's about what can be achieved. And actually, when we lock ourselves into this idea of productive versus unproductive work, we lose the ability to talk about reproductive work, which is what care is. Care can't be quantified, but it is so valuable in terms of the community that it builds, in terms of the emotional, physical, social support that it provides, and in terms of the relationships that you can build between care users and providers. But I think that currently what we have is really narrow terminology to talk about that. And I think that that stops us from being able to collectively bargain and from being able to think about solutions in a really nuanced way, because we are so hardwired to talk about to talk about care in a really limited way. Exactly. And I think, this is maybe a bit of an unpopular opinion. Sorry, should I hand the microphone back or can I ramble on? I know a lot of childcare workers prefer the term early years professionals, and I can completely understand why someone who has trained and studied would like their work to be valued and to be seen as a professional. However, I prefer the term childcare worker because I think, well, we should be able to value childcare in all its breadth and nuance and complexity for what it is, as opposed to jumping to this professionalized, quite masculine way of valuing that labor. This idea of early years professionals. It's well, why can't childcare work be valued because it's care? Why can't care be the word that we're holding up and saying this is valuable? So I think that just really that stuck out to me.
And I think it's interesting as well to be thinking about the kind of how the language of profit seeking and productivity sits alongside care work. And I wondered, Amy, if you could explain a little bit more about your research on the financialisation of the sector and how we stop, when we put government money into care, how we stop it leaking out as dividends and debt reservicing. I mean, I read somewhere that 10% of the social care budget goes on things like dividends and debt servicing. So it'd be interesting to hear from you.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, I think in some ways this would be, if we tackle the sort of leaking of money out of care, then that gives us more resources to reinvest in the sector so that people can be well paid, and people can access the kind of services that allow us to live good, dignified lives, right? So yeah, you're right that some of these financing costs have become extremely high. In the 2000s, there was a kind of bubble in care homes where they were basically being flipped and sold every couple of years for inflated values. And that's left some of the biggest chains with really crippling financing costs. So in some of the largest providers in the country, it's like 20% of their revenue is going on their debt repayments and interest, often in these kind of slightly shady loans to related companies that might be based in somewhere like the Cayman Islands. For no particular reason, I'm sure.
But would those facilities exist without the debt?
Well, I mean, a lot of care homes don't have that kind of business model. So whilst of course you need to invest to build and maintain care homes, you don't need to use these really complex financialized business models where you've got, for example, private equity or hedge funds coming in with their kind of high risk, high return business model, and seeking to save costs, which in care essentially means cutting labour expenditure, and also putting pressure on sort of supplies and food and so on for the residents. So yeah, I think in the research that we did around what happened to pandemic funding, our team found that in the for-profit care homes, which it's a big and diverse group, so there's lots of nuance to this, but their profits in the first year of the pandemic went up by 3 percentage points to 8%. And they paid out more to shareholders in many cases than they had before the pandemic. So that's extra emergency public money going in at a time when care workers were having to pull out all the stops and face, very severe risks in order to do their jobs. And in non-profits, they had a surplus that was stable of just 1%, and that gets reinvested in the service. And in our survey of care workers, we found that they were generally more positive if they were working in a not-for-profit setting. So I think your business model, Trudy, is an alternative. It's not your kind of big financialized chain. And as I said, I think there's a lot of diversity in the sector, but there are things here that can help to kind of keep money within care, make sure that it's going to the right places. And I just really echo your point, Veronica, about sort of, rather than seeing care as this kind of burden that has to be paid for by other activities, if we think about care as a kind of one of the main points of our society and our economy, and something that is a really valuable form of work, then that helps us to get away from the notion that we want to kind of cut costs to the absolute minimum. So yeah.
I think one thing that is discussed quite often now, especially on the left, is thinking of care as social infrastructure. The idea that it's completely foundational to society, like a road or a train line, but also that means it's sort of madness that at the moment we think of it as a kind of private problem when really it's a public good. And I wondered whether you found that kind of concept of social infrastructure a useful one, and if that's a sort of way forward, or if you had other thoughts of how we should be reconfiguring how we talk about care work.
Well, Fabian's report came out last week. I was at the launch, and that was of the many reports that we get about social care that get chucked out at us and then nothing happens with them. Quite an interesting one, I have to say. Lengthy, but very interesting. With all the recommendations that come with it, and I think the whole split between for-profit, not-for-profit, how it works, but I think the responsibility of investment back into the workforce. I'm not saying for-profit can't work, but it is where that profit goes. And the profit has to, in a big part, go back into the workforce. And again, not talking about care as a burden, as it's been mentioned,
and the relationships, and making sure that we understand that the society we live in, care is going to be a huge part of our lives, and we need to be proud of it. And we need to help understand, especially younger people, that there are career opportunities in it, and that we want to encourage younger people to go into social care, to work in it, and that it is a wonderful place to work. But recruitment is hard because people can't see it, because the pay is so low, the recognition is non-existent. So the society, the social thing, the society has to change its approach. For us at the Care Workers Charity, and me personally very strongly, a lot of it sits around professionalisation, registration of care workers. In the same way it's been done for nurses, and in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there is partial registration of care workers, and I think a kind of recognition of care workers as skilled professionals, where they have a career progression, where they have different pay grades, but not necessarily based on very academic qualifications, but it being more vocational and based more on their actual skills and expertise rather than arbitrary tests, because not everybody will want to do an arbitrary test. I think that's where we need to go with care work. What we don't want to do is put off existing workforce from staying, but we want to give people the recognition of their expertise. Going back to the social bit, is I think we need to give people, especially young people, an opportunity to go and experience this amazing feeling that is very difficult to put into words, what it's like to support people and what it gives you. But going back to your point and the points that many of us have made many times in conversations, just because it feels good, just because people who have the right values want to do it, it doesn't mean we can just call them heroes and not pay them enough. Yeah? It has to be properly funded, it has to be properly respected, but a care worker should be able to work 35, 37 hours a week and go on a nice holiday once or twice a year, have a nice place to live. I don't know if we're taking questions right now. I don't know if you raise your hands.
Yeah, I'm just really anxious to ask the panel if you would consider a new model, which is, if we think about, we used to have national service. Why? Because there was a common need, because people needed to be trained, ready to act for the country. So we've got a common need here, it's crisis. Everything you've said, there's a rationale. So if we were to have a 2-year course, a 6-month course, a modular course, doesn't have to be for just young people at a certain level. It could be degree level, looking at logistics, looking at forward financing, looking linked as this event is with climate change and environment well-being. But if we had the government mandated with a model of national service, then you would get young people who to come in and do so much time, but at that time they will learn the value of it, the fact that they're going to be in that village at one point, how to cost it, better ideas for how tech and AI can help. So it would be an exciting course for people because they would be able to jump off that and go into other careers. So I just want your ideas really, whether that would be worth something looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I'll just, because we're going to open it up for questions afterwards, so I just wanted to, as a kind of, give everyone on the panel just a last final opportunity to reflect on what they kind of see as the priority going forward. Like, what do they want the next government to do? What should a care revolution look like? And then we'll get to the question about a kind of modelled on national service course for young people.
That was such an interesting question. I'm like hoping to come back to that. But for me, I think we need a root and branch overhaul of the whole sector. But I think in order to do that, I would really like to go back to basics. And I think the key for me is having really strong mapping and analysis of who exactly is working in the care workforce at the moment. And the reason I say that is because I got into this because I was a childcare worker, and then we started organising during the pandemic. We initially started the Childcare Worker Solidarity Fund for people who've lost their jobs or been made homeless because of the pandemic, when we were giving out hardship grants to childcare workers. Not on the same scale as the Care Workers Charity, but it was just a few of us. And then we formed the union branch, and actually we had all of this energy and all of this need to take action. And what we were missing in terms of our strategy building was a real understanding of who's operating in the workforce. And it's not as easy to just looking at who is a registered care provider with Ofsted or who is registered with their local authority, because of the digitization and the increase in platform apps mean more and more care workers are taking on gig work in the grey economy, or they're working, ad hoc, and it's really hard to track. And that means that when we try and think of solutions, we miss pieces of the puzzle, we miss who's operating, and often the people that we're missing are the people who are on the lowest wages. And I'm thinking here of a lot of au pairs at the moment. There is a family worker exemption which precludes au pairs from being able to access the minimum wage. In theory, that makes sense. Au pairs are here on a cultural exchange. They're here to learn English, support with light childcare duties. But in reality, this is a loophole that is being exploited, so that many migrant workers are doing 40, 50 hours a week for as little as £40. And so I think that what I would do if I had my time again with the union organising would be to just go right back to basics and take the time to engage with the community organisations and the grassroots movements that are already organising childcare workers, and get a sense for who's out there and how we reach them. And then I think we can start to think through solutions that feel really comprehensive.
Thank you. I can keep my answer short on this one because I think the how we do it is going to come out in detail, and including in your ideas already. You've already had one great suggestion. But ultimately, it comes down to what we're trying to change, and stories are really important here. What I think is the priority for a social care revolution is to change the narrative around care work, so that we're actually valuing care work as the fulfilling profession that it is. There are lots of ways of doing that, whether it's the professionalisation through a register that Carolina's talked about, which I also support, other ideas that we've got, how it's funded, etc. But ultimately, if we change that story, then that's how we value care work for what it is, and that's how we start to make a difference.
Thanks, Judy. That feels like a good note to sort of end on. I don't want to take us back into something too kind of technical. Reading the report for Labour that you mentioned, Carolina, they're suggesting there should be more regulation by local authorities and a national regulator of sort of care company finances. I'm a bit unsure where the kind of ever more complex, people checking the accounts and the debt levels and so on of every company in the country is going to be the right way forward. I think that sounds, very expensive and bureaucratic and difficult to do effectively. I think perhaps, more recognition of the ways in which care is not a typical market. The people who are using services are often coming into the service at a point of crisis, particularly older people. And there's just a lot more complexity around those decisions than in some other purchasing contexts, right? We've talked about the sort of nature of care work. It's a job, but it's also something where the emotional and relational dimension is really important, and that's very hard to kind of price and measure properly. So I think perhaps trying to get away from this insistence that kind of it's a market, people are paid a market price for their jobs. We've got to kind of think about alternatives that really recognise the value of care and enable people to access kind of the support that they want and deserve.
Great. So want to try and make sure we can get through as many questions as possible. I have the one on the national service, but I wondered I could probably take two more questions initially if anyone else has a question at this stage. Yes, lady in purple.
The problem is that we're in an ageing society. That's the problem. And I'm Sue Lister, and we are started ageing without children. So you're now looking at single individual people who are aging alone. Their children have gone off, they haven't had any children, they couldn't have children, their children are disabled, their children have mental health problems. It's huge. There is an explosion of single people who are going to be in need of care by whoever the heck is available at the time, who has not been cut and whatever. And I have never had children on etc. I have got a very strong voice, and I am not going to put up with people who, and with care that is not wholeheartedly valued and respected. So, and I'm a theatre person, so you've now said story to me. I've said, you know, training and theatre and bringing it to the attention of people. You need, and I'm 78 years old, and I'm going to run out of steam. So who is going to take over this, carrying the voice of recognition and heart and value of people who are caring in a compassionate society, that kindness and kindness, that it, I'm running out of words, but that's what we need to have knocking about now.
Thank you. So that's going to be about how we, I suppose, how in this society you champion kindness. How do we make this a political issue? Because lots of people have tried for a very, very long time to make it a political priority, and that just hasn't been happening. So that's a great question. And one more question now, and then I'm going to throw it to the panel. Yes.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was going to talk on what she touched on, because I became a mom last year. And I work in the NHS and we have a training course. I can't go back to work full time as a nurse because childcare is not expensive. And obviously, when you look at care, a lot of it is provided by women. And so you're looking at a lot of women kind of like taking a step back when they give birth, when they have kids, because they can't afford to pay childcare because it's so expensive. So you're having people who are trained, people who still do the job, but they can't do the job because, you know, they can't afford to send their kids to nursery, you know, and so you're just at home, like, so now I have to kind of like retrain in another area to be able to work from home so I can still provide for my family. But obviously now you're leaving the care sector kind of like without, you know, more employees. So you're having, there's at least, you know, I wrote a book last year and I talked about, you know, there's about 800,000 women who are wanting to work full time but are not able to work full time. But now when you talk to the government about this, they look at it more as a social thing, so it's not a political thing, they don't want to touch it. And now all of a sudden the government are kind of like, I feel like they came up with, oh, we're going to provide so many more funded hours for this and that. I feel like they're kind of like politicizing it just to get back into government. They're using it as manifestos for, you know, the election, to be like, well, we'll provide this, but we'll provide this. But in respect, one, there's not enough places anyway. Most care places are, you know, nursery places are closing down. And so where is all these funded hours, even if you provide them, now, where are all these kids going to go? So it means that there's still so many women who are still going home, wanting to go to work, but can't go home. It's still expensive anyway. So I think it is really a broad range. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so lots there. I mean, it's about the sort of female empowerment and also kind of the intersection of unpaid and paid care work. How do you make it possible for people who are paid carers also make sure their own family is cared for? How do you give them that basic capacity that we all expect? So I'm going to go, I don't know who on the panel wanted to take the question about national service style training.
In terms of national service, interestingly, somebody asked me the same question last week, so I don't know if it's going around. I think in terms of national service, I wouldn't want to force anybody to work in care, because I think only people with the right values should work in care.
I think you need to embed it though. It's how you, I mean, you wouldn't call it national service.
Yeah, but
You would call it planning for your future.
yeah, true. So I think a theoretical course when you teach people about what social care is, because people have more contact with the NHS throughout life than we do with social care, because with social care you only get in touch at the point of crisis, like you mentioned. So that's quite different. So more teaching about what social care is, what you can, how you can plan for it, etc. I'd be very much for that. I think I would encourage getting people or young people work experience, maybe 2 weeks in social care, just to show them what a feeling it is. But doing a national service of a year or two for everybody, that would be a bit much.
You've got very brightest graduates in an undergraduate course having to go at least a module where they appreciate this whole problem. Then they could carry that with them and might learn to value. So talk about this value that underpins everything. If it was valued, you wouldn't really have so many of these problems. But the value isn't there. And the way you get value is to help these young people forecast where they're going to be in 50 years' time. And if they can't, if nobody's helping them see that, that's not just the type of care, that's the economy, the cost it's going to have, following people from other countries, no problem. And you can have very bright graduates or undergraduates looking at these statistical problems. And once they do that, you'll then get more voice, and that will lead to more.
No, I agree. Like I say, a difference between teaching about and making people work with, that's the only thing that I would split. That's all.
Trudy wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's an excellent suggestion, and I will caveat this that I haven't got a fully formed as to whether this is definitely the way to go, and my concern is actually the same one as Carolina's, because there are so many people who don't have the right values to make a great carer, and that won't change, that won't lift the sector. But where I think you've got something which is really important, which I can add evidence to, is that, you've talked about very bright people, graduates. We attract very bright people who are graduates to do care work today. Lots of them. We have a really high number of people with degrees doing care work for us. They do it because, for all sorts of reasons, but they want to give back to their community is one good reason. We saw that a lot in COVID, people who'd been furloughed and then or lost a job and went, I want to try something different, or did some volunteering during COVID and said, I don't want to go back to what I was doing before. I want something that matters. So we've seen a real change over the last few years. And an example is my very lovely colleague who came from engineering. She works in factories doing logistics. She's got an MBA. She didn't enjoy her work. Do you know the job she really enjoys? Is working as a wellbeing support worker, the name of our care workers. We don't need just the graduates to come in and sort out logistics. They make amazing carers. The diversity is huge. So if we go back to the storytelling, if we keep changing, telling these stories to show what it is, we attract more people in, and then I think we get a different level of confidence and a different level of value. We also get there's something important in what you were talking about, value exchange, and that comes from mixing different generations and people understanding the value that they get from supporting somebody else. It's not about that I am the supported person. Actually, it's about a trusted relationship and about a value exchange that goes both ways. I get value back from working in care, and I get that from the people I support because they are valuable people in society. And there's that second narrative, which is for our ageing population, changing the narrative around ageing. So definitely for the alternative ways of bringing new people in who never considered working in care because they have a different perception of it. I'm not 100% whether that's the right route, but we need to keep exploring those to see where we get to.
If you've got a generic course which looks at sustainability, climate change, future finances, care, there would be a generic, and those people going through that would then be educated to fight for it in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of great and very kind of interesting idea. I thought it'd be good to get onto I don't know if anyone on the panel wanted to talk about a little bit more about shifting the narrative around aging, shifting the narrative around care, and how to have physical impact. That lady there's I don't. Why do I always get the clock? I don't know. I think for me, again, I'm sure there's someone else on the panel who can speak to social care more broadly. My area really is childcare, but I think that what struck with me is that we are at a time where care is being talked about post-pandemic, and I think that we've seen this childcare announcement in the spring budget. This is a really exciting time where it's like, okay, we can get stuff on the agenda, but I also
maybe this is slightly cynical, I'm aware that there are people who've been organising around these issues for years and years and years. The reason why it's coming to the fore now is because it's starting to affect middle class women. So I'm thinking of, in terms of the childcare budget, that was pushed through in large part because of people like Pregnant and Screwed who are doing incredible work to point out childcare affordability. And what I'm trying to say with that is the people who have the largest voices are the people who are inherently more privileged, and those people are now the costs are so high and the quality is degrading so fast that even people with the money to afford quality care are struggling. Even people who are traditionally middle class are struggling to pay childcare bills. So it is crumbling so rapidly that we have people who have more voice than traditionally like low paid precarious workers and migrant workers who are able to come forward and say, actually, this is really bad. And I think that is why we are seeing this shift towards talking about care. And so for me, it's about jumping on that and jumping on the people who have that platform and trying to get them to extend the conversation. So with Pregnant Then Screwed, who have the ear of the government at the moment, they're doing a lot of work with the Women's Budget Group Early Years Coalition. I think some of that work is already happening. And the other thing that I just wanted to touch on, which I think you said, was that the government is politicising childcare. And I think that that really touches for me on this idea of it is politically useful for us to conceptualise childcare workers and parents, or care workers in general and parents, as diametrically opposed separate entities. We know that there is so much overlap, but as long as the government is talking about these two groups as completely at odds and dichotomous, we will struggle to make a unified front that can then mobilise and ask for better. So I think that that's a really useful thing to acknowledge, and I think that it's just about thinking of us as a monolith that are affected by the same issues, and they have the same solution. And what the government's doing in that funded hours offer is they're offering this additional money that is still underfunding the sector, so that when inevitably nurseries close and childcare workers leave the sector, they can kind of hold their hands up and say, well, we tried, we added more funding, that's not our fault, and parents will blame providers. So it's really tactical, and I think that that's kind of where I'm at with it. But did you want to say something in?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I think, we are seeing to some extent childcare chains following the same pattern of financialisation that we've seen in some of the big care home chains for older people. So that's something to, try and nip in the bud, really. And I think you're absolutely right about the kind of conflicts between different types of care. And as you mentioned, thinking about care, whether it's done in a paid or unpaid setting as reproductive labour, gets away from this idea of the opposition of interests between parents or service users and the workers. And what you were talking about with the kind of difficulties that you've faced in reconciling your family caring with your job, that really resonated with interviews that I did with care workers who in the pandemic had opportunities to progress, because in care homes there is a career ladder. You can become a senior care worker, you can go on to become a nurse and a manager and so on. But people were telling me they were offered those opportunities. Sometimes they took them and they found the jobs impossible to do in the way that they wanted, because they didn't have enough staff or enough resources and support. And so people were stepping back into more junior roles with less responsibility, because those are crucially important. But that's a problem. That's the kind of pattern of career regression that we're seeing, when we should be enabling people who want to have career progression in these jobs that are distributed around the country and can contribute to the economy in all regions. So that's something to deal with. And just very briefly, because I think we're running out of time, obviously. But I don't know if you've come across the Caring Across Generations organisation in the US, and they've been doing work on sort of trying to change perceptions of care and supporting carers from different backgrounds and people using care services to kind of tell their stories publicly and try to give a fuller picture of care and the possibilities and potential that it involves. So trying to overcome some of the sort of aversion that many of us might have to thinking about aging and vulnerability and so on. So that could be a good example to look into. But I think you're absolutely right that this needs, as much organisation as possible, and it's about, building power to translate many of these good ideas and smaller scale experiments into a transformed care economy.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I'm sorry we couldn't get round to more questions, but and thank you so much to everyone on the panel sharing your expertise.